So what you have is you have oogonia in the ovaries of a fetus. And those oogonia can undergo mitosis to grow, and you get more egg stem cells, and then they undergo meiosis, where you get one duplication of DNA and then 2 divisions. But these divisions are unequal, meaning when your oogonia divides, it's going to become one primary it becomes one primary primary oocyte, and then secondary oocyte after your first division. So what happens is you undergo mitotic divisions just to increase the number of egg stem cells, your oogonia. Then what you do is you start your meiosis. So in one of the divisions of meiotic division, you get 1 stem cell and 1 oocyte, just like in your development of sperm. You get 1 primary spermatid, spermatid. Here you get 1 egg stem cell or oogonia and 1 primary oocyte from mitosis. Then that primary oocyte starts meiosis, where you're going to then have 2 divisions. After the first division, which is unequal, you get your secondary oocyte, and another cell is not a full cell, but it's a polar body. It's basically just a nucleus. All the cytoplasm and organelles go into the secondary oocyte. This polar body might or might not divide. And either way, the cells will die and just get absorbed into the embryo as it's developing. Actually, embryoid body. Before your first 2 weeks after fertilization are an embryoid body, not an embryo yet. So that might or might not divide. Then you undergo your second division in meiosis, and you get your secondary oocyte, and then, but the thing is here, I messed this up completely. So you're going to get second division, and you're going to get a zygote from that, but that doesn't occur until after fertilization. So back when you all were a fetus, your ovaries started their meiosis, and what you got was 1 secondary oocyte and 1 polar body. And your actually before that, I messed this up. I'm really messing this one up. Let me start again. You start meiosis, but you actually get stuck in prophase 1 of meiosis 1. And your eggs are in prophase 1 of meiosis 1 from the time you're a fetus, like I'm talking like about 2 months before birth or so, or like 4 months before birth. And then they've been stuck in prophase 1 of meiosis 1 until each month you ovulate. And then what will happen is about a half a dozen or so follicles and their oocytes will start to develop. Only one of them typically finishes developing, and the others degrade away. And when you're ovulating, your primary oocyte will finish meiosis 1, and you'll get your 1 secondary oocyte and 1 polar body. That secondary oocyte will be released through ovulation. It will go into your fallopian tube, where then, if it's fertilized, it will finish meiosis 2. So when your egg is getting ready to develop, you finish meiosis 1, and you get stuck in metaphase 2. That's when they're lined up in the middle. And the chromosomes stay in metaphase 2 until the sperm fertilizes the egg and adds another 23 pairs of chromosomes, and then after that, you finish meiosis 2, and now you have a zygote, a fertilized egg, and another polar body. And this first polar body might divide or might not. So sometimes you get 2 polar bodies, 1 from each division, and sometimes that first polar body divides, so you get 3 polar bodies. Sometimes you only have 2. Okay. So you have about 5 million oocytes produced by the 4th month of prenatal life. I was a little bit off. I was thinking 4 months before birth, so 4 months after fertilization. And then about 2 million of those will start meiosis 1, but then stop at prophase 1 of meiosis 1, and they'll stay there until puberty, until each month you ovulate. Then about half a dozen will finish meiosis 1 and get stuck in metaphase 2. And then they're also surrounded by a follicle made up of granulosa cells or Graafian cells. So here's Graafian and granulosa. Multiple of these start to develop, like about half a dozen, and typically the one follicle that's producing the most estrogen continues on in development, the others degrade away. But if they don't degrade away, that's how you get non-identical twins, is by ovulating multiple eggs in 1 month. Okay, so then what will happen is you'll ovulate, and when you ovulate, what's coming out is a cell stuck in metaphase 2, and if that egg stuck in metaphase 2 and meiosis 2 gets fertilized, then you'll get a zygote. The cells that are surrounding the egg in the follicle are called Graafian follicular cells or granulosa cells, and these remaining cells that stay behind become the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum then produces a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin. And that is what what the P test strips test for when you're pregnant. So, and if you ever go like Walgreens and you get one of the P test strips and you pee on it and it shows that you're pregnant, you are pregnant. The tests at the hospital are just as accurate, and they won't even let you like get in to get tested if you're pregnant, because this home test kits are just as good. They do not have false positives. That's basically impossible, but they can have false negatives. So, and what the human chorionic gonadotropin does is it tells your placenta to stay and not be shed. Without that protein, you shed the placenta, and even if you are pregnant and you lose that hormone, then you lose the baby. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum will degrade. The corpus luteum will degrade. You'll lose the human chorionic. You won't have human chorionic gonadotropin if you're not pregnant. So the corpus luteum will degrade. I'm completely messing this up. I did not sleep well last night, and it's very obvious because my brain's not working today. If no fertilization occurs, then it's a developing egg that makes it's a fertilized egg that makes the surrounding cells that make your human chorionic. No, that comes from. Yeah, sorry, I'm completely messing this up. Okay, if you're not pregnant, the corpus luteum turns into corpus albicans and degrades, and then you lose your hormones and your uterine wall sheds. You lose progesterone. Sorry, I completely screwed this up. I will restart and go over it again. So let me go from this one here, and we'll talk about the actual follicle because I was missing information before. So we covered the egg, oocyte development. Now here's the follicle. So before ovulation, you have your oocyte surrounded by a single layer of granulosa cells that are a simple squamous layer of cells. And then about a half a dozen of your follicles start developing every month. And what will happen are those developing follicle cells will start to divide, and they'll go from squamous to cuboidal. So you'll go from simple squamous granulosa cells in a primordial follicle, And then when you start to have that follicle develop and the egg finishes meiosis 1, during that time, what's happening is the simple squamous granulosa cells become a simple cuboidal granulosa cells, and then they start to divide and you get multiple layers of cuboidal granulosa cells, and you develop this protein layer called the zona pellucida that's needed, it's important in fertilization. And there you have a primary follicle. And then what will happen is you'll develop a thick connective tissue capsule on the outside called the theca. And then you'll start to get these little fluid-filled cavities inside of the follicle, and at that point, we have a secondary follicle. When all the fluid-filled cavities combine into one gigantic fluid-filled antrum, then you have a mature follicle. But only one follicle will reach this mature stage, typically. The other follicles will degrade away because they're not producing as much estrogen. And then what will happen is you have this mature follicle, and the egg will literally burst out the side of your ovary and hopefully be taken up by the fimbriae that take it into the fallopian tube. When that happens, some of the Graafian or granulosa cells stay on the outside of the egg, and it's called the corona radiata for radiant crown. And the sperm have to dig their way through it, so it kind of slows down the sperm, so like multiple don't fertilize the egg at once, because then that would be a non-viable embryo. And then the remaining cells become your corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is what's going to produce your estrogen and your progesterone for the first about half of your pregnancy. Your placenta takes over the second half of the pregnancy, producing estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen is going to be what kind of gives you that pregnancy glow and how people can just know that you're pregnant by looking at you before they see your belly starting to grow. And the progesterone is what maintains the placenta. If you lose your progesterone, your uterine wall will shed. If you are pregnant, the fertilized egg and the surrounding cells will produce a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, and that will make the corpus luteum persist. If you don't have human chorionic gonadotropin, the corpus luteum will degrade to the corpus albicans. It will stop producing estrogen and progesterone, and the lack of progesterone will make the uterine wall shed, and you will then menstruate. And the lack of estrogen is what gives you PMS and makes you more emotional and moody during the beginning of your menstrual cycle. Because estrogen typically in women is a hormone that makes them happy. And so when you have this 2 weeks of high hormones, because your highest level of estrogen is going to be about the time you ovulate, and it's going to stay pretty high for the next 2 weeks, and then it's going to plummet about a day or two before you start to menstruate. Okay, we're going to watch this video. We watched the second half already, but we'll finish it. Or watch the first half.
Oocytes are immature eggs produced in the ovary by a process known as oogenesis. Prior to birth, about 2 million diploid primary oocytes are formed. Between birth and the first ovulation at puberty, the number of primary oocytes decreases to around 400,000. Only 400 will become secondary oocytes. Primary oocytes remain in prophase 1 of meiosis 1 until just before ovulation. Each primary oocyte is surrounded by layers of cells that support its development. Collectively, the oocyte and surrounding cells are known as a follicle. Just before ovulation, the primary oocyte continues meiosis 1 through metaphase 2, forming a haploid secondary oocyte. In the 28-day ovarian cycle, ovulation occurs about day 14. Typically, ovulation alternates monthly from one ovary to the other. Ovulation is the release of a secondary oocyte from a mature follicle, also called the vesicular or Graafian follicle. The ovulated oocyte is drawn into the uterine tube by fimbriae, finger-like processes that extend from the infundibulum of the uterine tube. Peristaltic contractions of the muscular wall of the uterine tube, combined with ciliary activity of the lining epithelial cells, move the secondary oocyte toward the uterus. Fertilization occurs in the ampulla of the uterine tube. During ejaculation, nearly 1/2 billion sperm are deposited in the vagina. A few thousand may reach the ampulla within 10 to 15 minutes. Only one sperm cell penetrates the secondary oocyte, triggering the secondary oocyte to complete meiosis II. The resulting haploid oocyte pronucleus unites with the haploid sperm pronucleus to create a diploid zygote with 23 chromosome pairs. Over the next 3 to 4 days, the zygote undergoes a series of mitotic divisions called cleavage as it moves along the uterine tube. This creates a solid sphere of cells known as a morula. The morula enters the uterine cavity and, during the next 2 days, is transformed into a hollow sphere known as a blastocyst. This differentiates into 2 groups of cells: the trophoblast, an outer layer of cells that form the placenta and embryonic membranes, and the embryoblast, or inner cell mass, which forms the embryo. Under the influence of the ovarian hormones progesterone and estrogen, the endometrium, or uterine lining, thickens to prepare for implantation of the blastocyst. Implantation, the attachment of the blastocyst to the endometrium, begins about 7 days after fertilization. As the blastocyst implants, the trophoblast cells further differentiate into an outer syncytiotrophoblast and an inner cytotrophoblast. The syncytiotrophoblast actively invades the endometrium, and by the end of the 2nd week of fertilization, the blastocyst becomes embedded superficially in the endometrium. The mitotic cytotrophoblast adds cells to the syncytiotrophoblast, which eventually surrounds the blastocyst. Ultimately, the syncytiotrophoblast forms the maternal-fetal blood barrier, across which nutrients and gases are exchanged.
Okay, and then the thing they didn't quite cover is what I was messing up on earlier. So, on day 7, after fertilization, the embryoid body embeds into the uterine wall. As soon as that happens, the placenta starts to create human chorionic gonadotropin. And that's the very first time you can tell you're pregnant. So during that first week, when you have a zygote developing into a morula, solid ball cells, you don't know you're pregnant yet because you're not producing human chorionic gonadotropin. And then when it embeds in the uterine wall on day 7, that's when you start to produce human chorionic gonadotropin, which is only produced by the placenta when you're pregnant. That's why there's no false positives on pregnancy tests. And that's why you can't get a pregnancy test until day 7 after ovulation, because you're not producing that hormone yet. So, and then this will be 2 things, Teach. It was really, my reaction to find out my son was alive was awful, because, well, first of all, my wife woke me up on day 7 with a pee test in my face, because that's the first time you can see that, and my reaction was like, oh, okay. Here's why. On that day, I knew my child only had a 50% chance of living. When a zygote is created, only about 50% of them attach to the uterine wall in the first place. Half of your embryo bodies come out in your next menstrual flow. Only about half attach to the uterine wall, and then of those, only half make it to term and are born naturally, ignoring abortions and things. But so really, only about 25% of all zygotes become a full-formed child. So that does mean that the vast majority of women have multiple miscarriages, even though they might not even know it. So, I mean, if only 25% of babies are actually born alive, that means 75% don't make it. So, And then what human chorionic gonadotropin does is it tells the corpus luteum to stay, keep on producing estrogen, progesterone, and the progesterone makes your uterine wall stay and your pregnancy stay. Okay, but we'll get more into that stuff in the next chapter. Okay, so again, with your eggs, you become a primary oocyte when you're a fetus. You finish meiosis. Actually, I want to mention this. The really important thing about being stuck in prophase 1 is that it protects your eggs from mutations. Because when you're in interphase, when you're not undergoing cell division, your DNA is all unwound, and it's easier for mutagens to make it get mutations and for radiation to cause mistakes. But when you're stuck in prophase 1, the DNA is all coiled together, and it's all like protecting each other because it's all tightly coiled, and it sits there for 9 to 50 years in your ovaries with condensed coiled DNA. Men protect our sperm stem cells by a blood testes barrier. Women do not have a blood ovary barrier at all. Your only protection is the fact that their cells are stuck in prophase 1 for decades at a time. Okay, so then you have your primary oocyte, finishes meiosis 1 right before you ovulate, and you get a secondary oocyte in one polar body. And then if the secondary oocyte gets fertilized by sperm, then meiosis 2 finishes and you get a zygote in another polar body. And then, again, through your follicles.
A primordial.
There we go, there. So a primordial follicle is what you have when you're a fetus, all the way up until you ovulate that month. And the granulosa cells are simple squamous. When these follicles decide that they're ready to ovulate that month, they will start to mature and become primary follicles when the simple squamous granulosa cells become a simple cuboidal granulosa cells, and then they become a stratified cuboidal cells, and you get this zona pellucida, which is a connective tissue membrane around the oocyte. Then you become a secondary follicle where you get this thick theca on the outside, another connective tissue membrane, and then or capsule, and then you get some fluid-filled vesicles starting to form. When the fluid-filled vesicles all fuse together, that becomes an antrum. And what this antrum kind of gives for us is it gives pressure to make the egg explode out of your ovary. Because your egg has to explode out of your ovary, and your theca kind of keeps it in. So like firecrackers, the reason they explode is because they are all enclosed. Like if you cut off the end of a firecracker, it just shoots out like a fountain. It has to be all enclosed in order to explode. So that's kind of what the theca is doing. It's holding it in until the fluid pressure in the antrum makes the egg explode out. And then you have your oocyte with zona pellucida and corona radiata, and the remaining granulosa cells become the corpus luteum. If you're pregnant, it will stay and maintain the first half of your pregnancy. And then if you're not pregnant, it'll degrade to the corpus albicans. Stop producing progesterone and estrogen, you'll get moody, and then you'll menstruate. And this is just showing that when you finish meiosis 1, right before ovulation, you get one secondary oocyte and a polar body that might or might not divide. And then after fertilization, when just the head of the sperm enters the egg, then you finish meiosis 2, you get a zygote and a second polar body.
A primordial follicle consists of an oocyte surrounded by a single layer of squamous granulosa cells. A primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle as the granulosa cells become enlarged and cuboidal. The primary follicle enlarges and the granulosa cells form more than one layer. The zona pellucida forms around the oocyte. The structure is called a secondary follicle when fluid-filled vesicles develop among the granulosa cells and a well-developed capsule, or theca, becomes apparent around the granulosa cells. The theca possesses internal and external layers. The structure is called a mature follicle when the fluid-filled vesicles form a single antrum. At full maturity, the oocyte is located in the cumulus mass. During ovulation, the oocyte is released from the follicle, along with some surrounding granulosa cells of the cumulus mass, called the corona radiata. Following ovulation, the granulosa cells divide rapidly and enlarge to form the yellow corpus luteum. When the corpus luteum degenerates, it forms the white corpus albicans.
Okay, so now more on your fallopian tubes or uterine tubes. I learned them as fallopian tubes as a child, but they're also called uterine tubes. The mesosalpinx, seen right here, above where the mesovarium comes off the broad ligament, that mesosalpinx is also part of the broad ligament. It holds your fallopian tube in place. And then it opens into your abdominal cavity, and it usually is able to then pull the egg in as it's ovulated. And then your unfertilized oocyte or the fertilized zygote then move through your fallopian tube with a combination of, actually it's mostly just cilia. So your cilia of your fallopian tube move your egg or your zygote along. There's not peristaltic contractions, it's just cilia, if I'm remembering correctly. And then, right here at the beginning of your fallopian tube is the ampulla, and this is where fertilization must occur in order to have a successful pregnancy. Because if it occurs after the ampulla, it will still form a morula, but it won't be at the right stage when it gets a uterus to embed into the uterine wall, because it has to be a blastula to embed into the uterine wall. If it gets a uterine wall too soon, it won't embed, and it'll come out as another little chunky in your menstrual cycle. So, that's really important. If you're trying to get pregnant, you need to have intercourse either up to 6 weeks before you ovulate, no, 6 days. 6 days before you ovulate, or on the day you ovulate. Because if you have sex 2, 3, 4 days after you ovulate, that egg can still get fertilized. You still get zygote, it just doesn't attach. And then your fallopian tubes have 3 layers. It has your outer serosa, which is your broad ligament, which is your peritoneum, basically part of it. You have in middle muscular layer that, yeah, it can do some peristaltic contractions and move it along. So it is peristaltic contractions and cilia. And then you have a mucus layer, and the mucus layer then kind of provides nutrients for the developing zygote and developing embryonic body as it moves along the fallopian tube. Because in that 1 week between fertilization and attachment, there's no blood supply going directly to it, so it just gets oxygen nutrients from the mucus that it absorbs. Okay, then, so that's what happens is, yeah. So embryonic mass moves through the fallopian tubes with peristaltic contractions and cilia. But that also gives you a little bit of kind of, you can still do stupid stuff and you won't damage your baby yet. So like say you go on spring break and you have sex on the first or second day, and then you have another week of drunken debauchery, it won't really affect the embryo body as much because it's not directly attached to you. It still will, but not as much. Okay, the uterus itself has multiple parts. I'll just show you on here. So the top, here we go. This part, the top part is the fundus, just like the top of your stomach is the fundus. Right? So there's the fundus, and then the main portion of the uterus is the body. This little part here is the isthmus, where the fallopian tube's coming in, and then down here is a cervix. Your cervix is the least contractile, more rigid part of your uterus. I thought it was a separate thing when I was younger, like middle school, high school age. I didn't. Then I realized it's just a part of the uterus. Okay. In general, the higher up the embryo body attaches, the more successful the pregnancy is. If it attaches lower, you lose it more often. Okay. You have a ton of ligaments holding the uterus in place. The broad ligament holding the uterus, the ovaries, and the fallopian tube all in place. You have a round ligament that goes from the uterus down to the ligament majora. I don't really know what that one's doing, because I mean, that connection doesn't really make sense. But then you also have a uterosacral ligament that attaches the uterus to the sacrum. And then your uterus has 3 layers. Your outer peritoneum is your peritoneum, your serous membrane of your abdominal pelvic cavity. Then you have a very thick layer of smooth muscles called your myometrium. This is what gives you cramps while you're menstruating, and then this is what gives you contractions when you're delivering a baby. And then there's an inner layer of your endometrium that has 2 layers. One layer that never sheds, and another layer called the functional layer that grows and then sheds off, grows and then sheds off. So your basal layer is the deepest layer. That's the layer that doesn't shed off. Your functional layer is the layer facing the inside, and that is replaced monthly during your menstrual cycle. And then again, the cervix is more rigid and less contractile than the rest of the uterus. And you have a cervical canal, that's an opening that's in your cervix. Each month it gets filled with a mucus plug, and that falls out on the day you ovulate. And then when you're pregnant, you get an even thicker mucus plug that stays in place until your water breaks, and then it comes out. And then, I mean, it's gonna come out because you're starting to dilate, and it's starting to get bigger, and it just falls out when you're about to deliver a baby. And then when you ovulate, your secretions changes to more of a kind of changes consistency. I always forget which way it goes. It's either kind of more mucus. I think it's more mucusy when you're not pregnant, when you're not ovulating. It becomes more watery when you're ovulating, to let the sperm swim up easier and not try to fight the mucus. Okay, so here's your fundus. Body would be this minus the fundus. Here's the cervix, your cervical canal, and the internal and external orifices. So again, fundus, body should be this minus the fundus and cervix. Okay, here's your endometrium. So this is myometrium that gives you cramps and contractions. And then your endometrium, you have your stratum basalis right here that doesn't shed, and the stratum functionalis up here that grows and then sheds, grows and then sheds. The vagina has 3 roles. It's to take the penis in during intercourse. It's to allow then menstrual fluid to come out each month, and then the baby to come out during birth. The hymen is not what people typically think it is. So your hymen is usually not a mucous membrane. There's a mucous membrane that more kind of just lines the outside of your vagina. It typically doesn't cover it. And that's a myth that people think it completely covers it. It's just a kind of mucous membrane around the outside, typically. And almost every single woman breaks her hymen before the first time she has sex. So the whole idea of like popping someone's cherry and they bleed the first time usually doesn't actually happen, because you break it way sooner. You might break it doing something like an activity like riding on a horse, or like doing gymnastics or things that when you're just really active you can break it, or when you put a tampon in like high school, like before you have sex, like you put it in, and that's gonna break it too. This is important because there are certain people and cultures who have wrong views on the hymen. And there's even like, there's an R&B artist, I don't listen to him, his name's T.I. He's like from the early 2000s when he's popular. But anyways, he would examine his own daughter's hymen once a year with a doctor present just to make sure she was still a virgin. So it's gross. And there are other traditions where you can get married, all the male siblings of the groom gather around and they examine the hymen to make sure she's still a virgin. And there's horrible things that happen to women if their hymen's not intact. It was probably broken from something else. But I don't want to be too insulting on other cultures, but it's some pretty your vagina does have muscular walls that can contract and relax, and then it's surrounded with a moist stratified squamous epithelium that produces mucus that contains a lot of glycogen. And that glycogen, not a lot, but some, that glycogen is a bunch of glucose molecules combined. And what you have is inside your vagina, you have good bacteria that eat that glycogen, and one of the waste products they make is acid. And so your vaginal fluid is always acidic. And what that acid does is that acid kills bad bacteria and yeast. And so if you do something like you douche and you clean out your good bacteria, or you go on antibiotics and your antibiotics kill your good bacteria, then you lose that acidity of your vagina, and the bad bacteria and yeast can grow more inside there. You do on the back of your vagina, you have longitudinal columns that run up and down, not on the back, on the front. Like right, if you go in the vagina just where it kind of meets the symphysis pubis, it would be right, not symphysis pubis, but right there on the front side, there are columns that run up and down. And then there's rings of transverse rugae that go around in horizontal rings, all to allow the vagina to expand when the penis goes inside of it, and expand a lot more when the baby comes out. And then there are little areas called fornixes that go around the cervix, because the cervix actually sticks down into the vagina. I'll just show you here, right here. See this little part here? That, I have it highlighted here. That part and that part are the fornix, and this is where sperm can hide if you have sex a few days before you ovulate, because your mucus plug is going to be there until you ovulate. So sperm cannot get into the uterus or the fallopian tubes until the day you ovulate, because your mucus plug is blocking the way. But you can have sex up to 6 days before ovulation, and the sperm can hide in the fornixes. And then when your mucus plug falls out, then the sperm can swim up the uterus. Now, is that going to be common for that to happen? No, because the vagina is acidic and acid kills sperm, but it can happen. So if you're using like the rhythm method, it really limits the amount of time you can have intercourse and not get pregnant. And we'll go over that when we actually get to the monthly menstrual cycle. This, what we're looking at, this is all the vulva. The female genitalia that you can see on the outside is the vulva. That tube there is a vagina. So your vulva, on the outside, you start with your labia majora. Your labia majora come up and then fuse together to form your mons pubis, the fat pad you have in front of your symphysis pubis. You have your labia minora. They come up and they fuse together to form your prepuce, or your clitoral hood. There's a tiny portion of your clitoris there. The clitoris then also extends into the body a bunch. Here's your urethra between the clitoris and vaginal orifice. And then this is your perineum, your clinical perineum, where you might get a episiotomy when you're about to deliver a baby. That's when they take a scalpel and they cut your vagina to make it so that when it tears, it doesn't tear as bad and it tears cleaner. Because some women, when they have a baby, it doesn't tear at all. Some women, it tears a 4th degree tear where the vagina and the rectum become one tube. And then you have to stitch it all back together. And then that's scary, because that actually tears through your external anal sphincter, and that means that in the rest of your life you might be incontinent, or you might have like anal leakage after that.
On that, I've actually done some reading on it, and from what I read, it says that it's almost like that practice is being slowly out of use, because they have found that it's better to let a woman naturally tear.
To naturally tear?
Yes.
They're not.
That to cut it, because the healing is better if it's naturally
natural?
tear. That stitch it back together.
Yeah, either way sucks.
It does.
So yeah, definitely talk to your obstetrician about that, and just prepare for that. Also,
I heard you can tear up instead of down. So.
tear
that's-
this way towards your urethra.
Yep.
Yeah, that's possible as well. So, that's also why women need a long recovery after pregnancy. You're not just taking care of a newborn, you're taking care of yourself as well. So, 6 weeks is not enough. And we don't even, we ask you as a student to come back after like 2 weeks. Ask. Don't demand, but ask. I think it's too soon. my wife and I, we took off 3 months. Because actually we timed our son to do that, because my wife works for the school, public schools, and so she gets like 2 months off, and then I get like 3 months off, and so we gave ourselves a 3-month window to get pregnant. And if we didn't get pregnant into that 3 months, we were gonna wait till the next year. But we got pregnant on the 2nd month. So, and that timed it perfectly. Our son was born during finals week. So I was able to like get my finals all scheduled around a C-section, so I knew when it was coming. So we had it scheduled. And then I'd just come back to like do a little bit of grading. I'd work like half days and then go be with my son and wife. And then we had the summer off, which was amazing. So, let's see, there's a few more things. The space in between your labia majora is called the pudendal cleft. The space between the labia minora is the vestibule. The labia majora are covered with hair and apocrine sweat glands. Labia minora has no hair. Labia majora is literally the same thing as a guy's scrotum. And labia minora is literally the same thing as a Raphe, the line that runs down the scrotum in the middle. And then there's another vestibular bulb that I'll have to show you on the inside for this. Let's see. So within the vestibule, there's a bunch of glands that keep it moist at all times, secrete mucus. Labia majora, they have sebaceous glands, sweat glands, and hair. And pudendal cleft is between labia majora. And then women do have a fat pad that men don't have. A little pooch above their vulva that makes them look a little bit bigger, but that's normal. Okay. So here on the outside you have your labia majora that fuse together to form your mons pubis. Labia minora, and then here's a vestibule, the area within labia minora, and there's a vaginal orifice. Inside, this is how big your clitoris actually is. I already showed you on the nanomesh table. So this little chunk right there, that's all you think of as a clitoris there, but inside the body you have a crus, because that's literally, it's the clitoris is the same thing as a corpus cavernosa of a penis. And so the crus veer off to the sides, and the clitoris does the same thing as a penis does. It stands more upright, and it gets about 2 to 3 times as large. Doesn't always, I mean, some, like even with guys, some guys are growers and some guys are showers, some it just gets hard, some it gets bigger and hard. So same with clitori. But they do stand up more. You even have two set of muscles that make it stand up even more called the ischiocavenosa muscles. And what that does is it increases physical impact during intercourse, and that's what gives women pleasure. And then you have vestibular bulbs here. These are literally the same thing as a guy's bulb of the corpus spongiosum of the penis. And these also get engorged with blood when a woman is aroused, and will make the vaginal opening smaller because they get filled with blood and they surround that. And the vestibular glands produce some of that mucus that's in the vestibule. And that is it. Oh, here's the muscles I was just talking about. So this muscle here going up to the clitoris is called the ischiocavenosa muscle. On guys, it's what guys use to make their penis jump up and down when they have an erection, if you have ever seen that. Women can do the same thing with their clitoris, make it stand up a little bit more erect to get more impact during intercourse. And then you do have your bulbospongiosa muscle that is outside the vagina, and that's one of the muscles you when you're doing Kegels to make your vagina tighter, that's a muscle you can squeeze. Women typically flex that muscle during orgasm, and women can also learn how to flex it during intercourse just to squeeze down on the penis and increase pleasure for both. Okay. Mammary glands, they are a combination of fat and mammary glands. If you have dense breast tissue, that means you don't have very much fat, and your breasts are mostly just mammary glands. And there's only one issue with that. If you have dense breast tissue, it makes mammograms more difficult and can block the view of tumors. So just a slight warning if you have dense breast tissue. These little blue lines here, they're not blue, they're just colored blue in this picture, but they are called Cooper's ligaments. These Cooper ligaments are what keep breast upright when women are younger, and then of course their ligaments become weaker as you get older, and so the breasts then sag due to gravity and the loss of those ligaments. Your mammary glands themselves secrete in both an apocrine and a holocrine mechanism, so you have whole chunks of cells going out. And what are cells made up of? Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. What do babies need for a full year to live? Carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids that all come from milk. And milk can sustain a life for a full year. It's ideal that you breastfeed for the first year, but then you're also introducing solid food around like 9 months or so. But it's enough to do that. But if you can't breastfeed, it's fine now, because baby formula has gotten a lot better. And then about 15 years ago, it got better. So if you guys were fed on formula, the formula sucked. But like my son, who was on formula and breast milk, it was better. They're missing some vital nutrients in the past that they had for brain development. So then your mammary glands are also surrounded by smooth muscles. So when you hear your baby's "I'm hungry" cry, or the baby mechanically stimulates the nipples by suckling on the nipples, that mechanical stimulation causes you to release oxytocin from the brain, and oxytocin causes your milk to let down. You'll get like pins and needles in your breast, and milk will then spray out. And I learned about that spraying out when I was a kid watching Roseanne TV show, because Roseanne's sister had to wear milk pads when she was breastfeeding, because the baby would cry and then it would spray out. And then you have lactiferous ducts that take the milk to the nipple, and you don't just have one opening on your nipple, you have a bunch of them. You have like 4 or 5 or 6 of them. And so when milk does come out, it doesn't come out just one hole, it sprays out in a bunch of different directions at the same time. And then this last thing on your areolas, everyone has areolar glands. Just some women they're visible, some women they're not. And what those glands do is they produce a little bit of mucus, and that mucus helps prevent chafing during breastfeeding. That's if you have bumps on your areolas, that's what they're for, is to prevent chafing during breastfeeding. Okay, this is a very important slide, and this one I do definitely want you to study a lot on here. So we'll run through this, and it's really complicated. So let's just start working our way through it. So, your menstrual cycle, you can think of it in like 2 ways. You can think of it in terms of your follicles. So the first half, so you first have menstruation. That's where your menstrual cycle starts, on the day that you first have blood come out. You first have menses come out. Then that lasts 3 to 7 days or so, with an average being around 5, but every woman's different on how long they bleed, how much they bleed. And then after that, the next phase, in terms of your follicles, is the follicular phase, because your follicles are developing. Then after ovulation, your follicular cells turn into corpus luteum, so then you have your luteal phase. So this is the follicular phase, developing follicles, and this is the luteal phase. Or you can speak in terms of your uterus. So this phase here, where after you stop bleeding, this is the proliferative phase, where your uterine wall is growing at a really fast pace, so proliferating. And then this is the secretory phase, where the uterine wall is still growing, but it's also producing a lot more mucus and getting ready for the embryo to embed, embryonic body to embed. So those are the different phases. There's 3 of them. You have menses, and then you have your follicular phase / proliferative phase, and then you have your luteal phase / secretory phase. I personally think the follicular phase and luteal phase is more important, because that's what's more important, is your corpus luteum and your follicles. Okay, and then this top graph here is in green, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, but this is missing one thing. There should be another spike of follicle stimulating hormone here. I used to have a video that went over the slide, but I lost the video because Flash went away. And that video was correct, this one's not. So I would add that little boost of follicle stimulating hormone here. These are developing follicles. This is your estrogen that's being produced and your progesterone. So now let's go through this day by day, not quite day by day, but section. So your menstruation starts on the beginning of your menstrual cycle. You will then menstruate, and menses will come out. And then when your menstruation stops somewhere around day 5, that's the beginning of your proliferative phase, and even a little bit before that, you had your follicular phase starting. So what's happening is, very first thing that happens is you have this little spike of follicle stimulating hormone, and what do you think follicle stimulating hormone is going to do? Stimulate your follicles. So that's why that beginning peak is important, because it causes your follicles start to develop. So again, you're going to have about half a dozen or so follicles start to develop. You'll go from a primordial follicle to primary to secondary to mature. And the follicle that's producing the most estrogen will win the estrogen race, and that's the one that will then ovulate. The ones that are producing a little bit less estrogen, they will degrade away. Then what's going to happen is, as these follicles are developing, these follicles are producing estrogen and progesterone. The progesterone is what is making your uterine wall grow, and the estrogen is making you happier and in a better mood. And then what will happen is you ovulate when you have a huge spike in both luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and that will cause a mature follicle to actually ovulate. But what that luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone are also doing is making you get a huge peak in estrogen and more progesterone. And so this huge peak in estrogen is going to make women a lot typically more happier and more in the mood for intercourse on the day that ovulate, because obviously the only day that even makes sense to have intercourse if you're trying to get pregnant is on the day you ovulate. So, and actually, if you're trying to get pregnant, you should not have sex before then, because you want the sperm to build up. Because you make about 50 billion a day, and if you wait 10 days between ejaculations, then you can get up to 500 billion, 500 million. No, did I say 50 billion? I meant 50 million sperm a day. So, and then you get about 500 billion or 500 million sperm in a larger ejaculation. So if you're trying to get pregnant, the guy should not ejaculate every day. If you're trying to prevent prostate cancer, he should. So then you get this peak in estrogen that makes you happy in the mood for sex. And then what will happen is you'll ovulate, and the remaining granulosa cells will turn to the corpus luteum that will then still produce estrogen and produce a bunch of progesterone, and the progesterone will continue to make the uterine wall maintain and not shed. If you are not pregnant, the placenta will not produce human chorionic gonadotropin, and your uterine wall will then shed. And why that happens is, without human chorionic gonadotropin, the corpus luteum degrades to the corpus albicans, and it stops producing estrogen and progesterone. Now, what you've had for the last 3 weeks is you've had pretty high levels of estrogen. So you've been on a drug that's been making you happy in a good mood for about 3 weeks. And then when the corpus luteum turns into the corpus albicans, you undergo literal withdrawal from your estrogen, and that withdrawal from estrogen will make you moody and upset and irritable, things like that. At least the textbook has it written down, extreme emotional disturbances. Now I can say that's the textbook saying it, not me. So, and then, so the lack of estrogen makes you in a bad mood, and then the lack of progesterone makes the uterine wall shed. If you are pregnant, the human chorionic gonadotropin will tell the corpus luteum to persist, and you'll continue to produce estrogen, so that will stay high, and you'll continue to produce progesterone, and that will stay high. The progesterone will maintain the pregnancy, and the estrogen will make you in a fairly good mood, fairly have a pregnancy glow, except for now you're also dealing with morning sickness as well, and that sucks. But during the rest of the day, you should be pretty happy when you're in your early pregnancy. The last trimester is happy. It's uncomfortable, it's awful. Oh, okay. So then your menstrual cycle, again, it's usually about 28 days long on average. And your first time you bleed is called menarche. and the menarche is your first menstrual cycle, and that happens when your gonadotropin releasing hormone levels increase, follicle stimulating hormone increases, and you start to stimulate your follicles to develop. And then I already covered this. Amenorrhea is a lack of having a period, and the one thing I'll say about amenorrhea, when you don't have a period, it's the biggest cause for that is that you don't have enough body fat. And that is like the answer I will always give when a woman asks me if they're too skinny, which has happened twice from students. And the correct answer is you are too skinny if you're not having your period. Because what your body's doing is you're saying, you're about to die because you're starving. And so if you're about to die because you're starving, because you're anorexic, how are you gonna support a baby? And so what it does is if you're so skinny that you're not having, what it does is shuts down your period, shuts this whole thing down so you can't get pregnant, because then you're not be able to have the baby survive. And that's actually one of the reasons or theories why we think girls might be starting menstruation earlier than they used to. Like it used to be like 11 or 12 is when girls would get the first period. Now it's closer to like 8 or 9 for a lot of girls. And so the two kind of big theories are children are bigger. Like literally so when I was a kid, this was what we considered morbidly obese. Like the whole joke was how horribly fat and obese this kid was. That's what the 80s were like. Everyone was skinny. Now that kid's skinnier than the average kid. And so people just have more body fat now. And so that's one reason girls might be starting puberty earlier. The other one is maybe it's all the hormones that we consume when we're eating like animals and stuff. They would get treated with hormones. So that could be it. I don't know. We don't know. But those are two options that might make sense. Okay. And then, so the thing with saying about fat is now that kids are larger, their body's like, oh, you have all this fat, you're gonna live really well. You have so much fat you can support another life, and you can then get pregnant. So that's the theories. And then menopause is a cessation of your bleeding. So what you actually go through is something called perimenopause for a few years, and then your last year of perimenopause is menopause, where then you stop having your menstrual cycle, and your menstrual cycle will become sporadic. It can be heavier some months, lighter some months. You might skip it a couple months. You might have a super strong one. You go through hot flashes, mood swings, things like this for like 3 to 5 years or so, and then you stop menstruating ever again when you then run out of follicles. So the controls of this are that you release growth hormone releasing hormone from your hypothalamus. Growth hormone releasing hormone makes you produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone literally makes your follicles grow or develop. So they stimulate them to develop, and then your follicles increase estrogen production. Makes you in a better mood for a while. Luteinizing hormone also helps with the maturation of your follicles, increases estrogen productions. Luteinizing hormone is what causes ovulation to occur, and once ovulation occurs, then your remaining granulosa cells become the corpus luteum. Your estrogen and progesterone can both make the uterine wall grow, and then progesterone is what maintains your uterine wall when you're pregnant. And then your estrogen can come back and act in a positive feedback loop. I'll have a good video for this next. We actually watched it earlier in the semester. And then your progesterone comes back and acts in a negative feedback loop. So progesterone comes back and inhibits growth hormone releasing hormone and the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So what do you think your birth control is made up of? All birth control is made up of progesterone because it acts in a negative feedback loop to prevent the release of growth hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So, but then some birth controls are also then don't have estrogen, and so my old colleague who was an endocrinologist went to the doctor demanding he gave her estrogen because, and I'll use her words that she gave me permission to use, but she called herself a raging bitch when she was on birth control because she was on a progesterone only birth control, and so she was lacking estrogen. And so then when she went to the doctor and demanded estrogen pills that which she got from the doctor, she called them her happy pills because she would take estrogen and then later on that day and the next day she was happy. Without her happy pill, she was miserable. So yeah, there's a good video on this one.
During the menstrual cycle, before ovulation, small amounts of estrogen are secreted from the ovary. Estrogen stimulates the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone also stimulates release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Luteinizing hormone, in turn, causes release of additional estrogen from the ovary. The levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone increase in the blood due to this positive feedback effect. After ovulation, the corpus luteum is formed in the ovary and begins to secrete progesterone in response to luteinizing hormone. Progesterone inhibits the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Blood levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone decrease because of this negative feedback effect.
Okay, so now when you have a lack of progesterone because your corpus luteum degraded into the corpus albicans because you're not pregnant, so you don't have human chorionic gonadotropin, what will happen is that will cause spiral arteries in your uterus to start to spasm. So they'll close for a while and then open for a while. Close for a while, open for a while. When they close, they cut off blood supply to your functional layer. So they close, they're cutting off oxygen and glucose to your functional layer, and this causes your uterine wall, your functional layer, to die from necrosis. It's the only time in our body where cells die from necrosis on purpose. Every other time, they die through apoptosis. Apoptosis is a programmed cell death where the cell breaks into little tiny vesicles, kind of pinch off, and then macrophages can come along and eat up the nice clean mess. Necrosis means the cells explode. And that's then a lot more work to clean up. And so then that causes inflammation and issues, and it's just not good. This is the only time our body's ever supposed to die from necrosis. So the cells die, and the tissue starts to die, so little chunks start falling off, and then the spiral arteries open again, and now you have an artery leading into nothingness because all the tissue died, so then the blood just goes out. And then they spasm again, close, more tissue dies, then they open, and you bleed into open space, because now that tissue's dead and it's falling off. And so then your menstrual fluid is a combination of blood and chunkies that have fallen off your uterine wall. So here's even little chunks falling off there. The uterine wall is dying, and then here's it's regrowing in proliferative and secretory phase. Okay, so your female behavior and sex act. So your female behavior is dependent on your androgens from your adrenal gland. So it's actually dependent on testosterone from your adrenal glands. And your other steroids like estrogen make you more in the mood and more happy and in the mood for sex, but you also need testosterone from your adrenal glands. And then with women, it depends largely on psychological factors. So with men, you just have to, one, have testosterone, and two, something just has to poke it, just touch it, and it'll get erect. Touch it a bunch more, and the guy will ejaculate, no matter what it is. With women, in order to get into the mood, to become naturally lubricated and to orgasm, takes being in the mood for that to happen. So, what happens is when a woman does have estrogen and testosterone, and she's in the mood, like psychologically, like her spouse did something really nice for her, or like did a chore that they haven't done for a while, or took her out on a fancy date, something like that. It'll get her more in the mood. And then what will happen is the parasympathetic nervous system will kick in, and that will make the clitoris and the vestibular balls become engulfed with blood, so they'll get bigger and harder. And nipples will become erect, and you'll start to produce more mucus from your vagina to allow more lubrication during intercourse. Because without lubrication, there can be tearing that occurs. So, and then I just left this in here because the textbook added this last sentence down here. Orgasm is not necessary for fertilization to occur. I leave that in here because people do believe it. There are people that believe that this is horrible. I do not believe this. Other people believe this, that a woman must have an orgasm to get pregnant. And if she orgasmed, that meant she enjoyed the sex, and that meant it couldn't be rape. So there are people who argue if a woman is raped and she gets pregnant, that then she enjoyed it and she orgasmed. So it wasn't actually rape. It's just people who try to defend rapists, and there should be never any defense for any rapist at all, ever. So those are just horrible things that happen. We'll cover this more in the next chapter, but we'll do a little bit here. So what happens when you get pregnant is the guy will ejaculate, again, preferably onto the cervix, where the semen will coagulate, and then fibrinolysin will slowly break down the clot to have the sperm swim up the uterus. The sperm will swim up the uterus, go all the way to the ampulla of the fallopian tube, and fertilize the egg. And this has to happen within 24 hours after ovulation in order to get a successful pregnancy. But sperm can also live in the vagina for up to 6 days before ovulation. And then we already covered ectopic pregnancy, so we don't need to cover that again. And then what will happen is once you have fertilization, then you'll start to form, you'll get a zygote. And then you go from 1 cell to 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Between that 16 and 32 cell stage, you become a morula, which is a solid ball of cells. Then you go from 32 to 64 and then 128. So 2 days later, after being morula, you become 128 cells, and you form a hollow sphere of cells with an inner cell mass. So, and the inner cell mass becomes the embryo, and the hollow sphere becomes a placenta, but we'll get to that next chapter. And then for the first 2 weeks, you're an embryonic mass, and the outer layer of the embryonic mass is the trophoblast that will become the placenta. And then once the embryonic mass embeds in the uterine wall, the trophoblast starts to create human chorionic gonadotropin that tells the corpus luteum to persist. And then these are showing your progesterone and estrogen levels throughout your pregnancy. So what's happening during your first trimester is your placenta produces human chorionic gonadotropin that tells your corpus luteum in your ovaries to persist and to produce estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen will make you happy, progesterone will maintain the pregnancy and maintain the uterine wall. During the second trimester, you get a little bit less human chorionic gonadotropin, and your ovaries will produce less estrogen and progesterone, but then your placenta starts to take over estrogen and progesterone production in the second trimester. In the third trimester, your corpus luteum stops producing estrogen and progesterone, and your placenta takes over the entire role. So in the third trimester, the placenta is maintaining the pregnancy. And then your estrogen and progesterone levels just keep on going up and up until the baby gets stressed because it runs out of room, and then the baby tells the mom it's ready to come out. We'll get to that next chapter. So menopause, again, happens somewhere in women's 40s to 50s. Your periods become less regular, more sporadic, and your final, your end of your menopause is menopause. Before that is perimenopause. The actual cessation of your menstrual cycle is menopause. Your luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormones are still high, but the few remaining follicles you have are just less sensitive to them, so they stop becoming stimulated to develop. And then the ovaries stop producing estrogen and progesterone. Once you no longer have any progesterone, your uterine wall will not grow, and so there's nothing to shed. So you won't menstruate again. Then you have a lack of estrogen, and that causes all the problems women have. Is like with osteoporosis and stuff, is lack of estrogen. And so a lot of women go on hormone replacement therapy after menopause to keep other things working well. So you'll get, during menopause, you'll get hot flashes, irritability, night sweats, fatigue, anxiety, and as a textbook post, severe emotional disturbances. And here's things that can happen when you get older. Your menstrual cycles become sporadic. The vagina becomes thinner and doesn't produce as much mucus. And so if you don't start using lubrication, if you did beforehand, you should start using it as you get older, like after menopause, because if you don't lubricate after menopause and the woman doesn't produce natural lubrication, the vagina can tear. And then she's getting older, and then every organ has less blood supply, and their cells divide slower, so the vagina heals slower and things. And then fertility becomes really kind of starts to get scarier after age 35 because of birth defects and things that you can get. But still possible. And then really quick, let's just finish this. You can pack up. No, never mind. I'll finish this on Wednesday. I don't want to do that to you.